I'm sitting here instead of where I'm reading.
I have to say,
Good afternoon.
I'm
I'm Charlie Firestone with the Aspen Institute Communications and Society Program. Delighted to welcome the people here in the Aspen Institute headquarters and also online. We're streaming online. And our hashtag is AI Net Neutrality. We hope you'll have some online dialogue as well. So the Aspen Institute is a nonpartisan, nonprofit convener of various conferences and seminars. We try to have enlightened leadership. We aim for enlightened leadership based on timeless values. Among the policy programs at the Aspen Institute is the Communications and Society program, which you are all a part of now. And we look at the impact of information and communications technologies on societal institutions. We are not, we don't come at it with an answer, what's the question? I think there's a lot of places in Washington where we have the answer, just tell us what the question is. We come at it with a kind of a neutrality. So we're basically neutral, if you can be, on net neutrality. Some people will ask who our funders are, this is actually this particular session is not funded by anybody other than the Aspen Institute. Our funders come from both the corporate sector and the nonprofit foundation sector. And those in the corporate sector are from the carrier, the content, the equipment manufacturers. It's basically every kind of communications and retail, in some cases, retail companies. So it's a very broad base, and we are not aiming to advance any particular interests. We've invited a very large panel here, so large that they said there's no room for me, the Institute people, so I'm here on the side. And they are proxies for the various interests and expertise in this field. And I'll introduce them individually. But I also understand that there's a lot of expertise here in the audience and obviously online. I'm not sure how much we're going to be able to get feedback from the online audience on the Twitter feed, but we will have plenty of time for questions, answers, and frankly, comments. I don't really feel that it has to just be a question if you have a comment. I am trying to have this discussion go beyond the rhetoric, the religion, the special interest, the individual interest to a understanding of the net neutrality issue and aimed at, as one person at one of my conferences said, new insights that you can act on. So hopefully we can gain some new insights on the net neutrality issue and hopefully advance the ball. Now this august panel, so we can't have all the different consumer advocates and all the different think tanks and all, but we were very pleased to be able to bring in essentially the originator of net neutrality, at least the language, and certainly one of the outspoken intellectuals on the topic, which is Tim Wu from Columbia Law School. We can't bring in all the different carriers. We wanted to have the carrier interest, and we're pleased that we have the Senior Executive Vice President, I believe that's right, Senior Executive Vice President of AT&T, Jim Ciccone, who has been very outspoken. Jim has passed, well, they all have passed, sorted and other. Tim, among others, was clerk to Judge Posner on the Seventh Circuit and Justice Breyer in the Supreme Court. Obviously very impressive. And Jim worked in two White Houses, in the Reagan and the George H.W. Bush White House as Deputy Chief of Staff. He's been at a law firm in town and has been long General Counsel and now Senior Executive Vice President of AT&T. We can't have all the different content companies, but one that's been quite outspoken in recent months has been Netflix, and we have Netflix's senior executive in Washington, Chris Libertelli, who before going to Netflix in the end of 2011, worked for Skype, headed up their government relations, and has a career from as a communications lawyer before that. We don't have a lot of investors in these businesses, but we have an investment analyst who's been at it for 30 years, who is now a visiting senior policy scholar at Georgetown University Center for Business and Public Policy, and that's Anna Maria Kovacs, who's very knowledgeable on the communications policy world. I felt we really needed basically a net engineer, so we got one of the best, certainly one of the best that I've ever come across, and that's Anna Slomovic, who is a visiting scholar at the Center for International Science and Technology Policy. She's also a privacy advocate and at one time was Chief Privacy Officer of Equifax. And our utility infielder, who is also a fellow at our own Aspen Institute Communications and Society program, Blair Levin, who many know was Chief of Staff in the Reed Hunt FCC, and then headed up the broadband plan, the broadband policy plan?
National Broadband Plan.
National Broadband Plan at the FCC. In fact, he was Executive Director of the Omnibus Broadband Initiative, which we all know as OB1. He was OB1. Okay. So what we're going to do is not start with speeches, but rather I'm just going to turn to Tim and say, you came up with this the word net neutrality. What is net neutrality?
Sure. Well, let me first thank you for having us here and putting together such a great panel. Net neutrality is, I guess, best described as a principle that describes how carriers ought carry packets on the internet. The basic principle advocates a non-discriminatory treatment of similar traffic, says that to the extent possible, it'd be great to treat all packets more or less alike. The idea behind the principle is that this, which has been sort of the de facto, built into the de facto design of the internet in many ways and protected by a series of laws or policy statements over the last 10 years, is that the equal treatment over the last mile, particularly of the internet, gives companies a fair chance to compete on the merits as opposed to compete based on who has preferential treatment from the carrier. So that's more or less the principle. The earlier name for it was the end-to-end principle, and it is interpreted by different people in different ways.
Great. By the way, I did want to say one other thing before and that is Aspen comes from the standpoint of, as I said, timeless values, but at least you want to get out what the values are. And I've identified several values that I think are behind this whole debate. And I think as the panelists talk about net neutrality, it'd be useful to at least say whether you think that there's one value over another that takes precedence. And the values that I would like to at least point out are free expression, which I think is a strong basis, consumer choice, basically consumer welfare, but that includes consumer choice, and that could be an element of transparency, of competitive options, of quality of service. Innovation, and innovation at all levels, whether that's at the carrier level or at the application or content levels. But essentially, we in our country really feel that it's extremely important to foster innovation. We want investment in networks, in applications, and in content. We want new investment. And we have those protective areas of security, privacy, and safety, essentially parental controls, that we want to assure are still on the internet. So those are some of the values that I think merit, and if you feel that there's one that I've left out that's really important, or one that doesn't belong there, or one that takes precedent, I think it would be useful.
Let me add to that a little bit. I think there's a reason that this debate has attracted attention, and not only as communications debates usually do among a very narrow set, but among a wider set that includes even TV comedians. And I think it is because it does sort of put all fundamental questions about American infrastructure and the values we put into it, not many of which you named. One thing I'd say is that it in some ways asks the question about what the internet is and whether it is still in some sense the American frontier, the place that people sort of try out their new idea or try and start a movement or run for office or do all these kind of random things. And it's been, for 2 decades now, it's kind of been the place where you try it out. Doesn't mean you're going to succeed, but you have at least an opportunity. There's always been a frontier somewhere in America, whether it was the West or whether it was America itself. And I think one of the reasons that so many passions are given rise to by this is the constant fear of a closing of a frontier, of less opportunity, of limits on speech and innovation and so forth. And that's my admittedly biased view of the thing.
Good. Anna is our engineer, and as he talks about neutrality on the network, maybe you could give us some more of an technical take on what we mean by net neutrality.
Well, when I think about net neutrality, the question I ask is neutrality with respect to what? So the vision that Tim described is a packet is a packet is a packet, first come, first sent is essentially one way of thinking of net neutrality. Well, the fact is that even now, the internet is not neutral in that way because there are companies that locate edge servers close to where content will be requested, and the shorter the travel distance, the less time the packets travel. So we already have situations in which in the way that Tim described, the net is not neutral. And the question is, if we go to some form of net neutrality, do we want to change the way the net operates in that way? Another possibility is that the net would be neutral with respect to quality of service. So if I pay for faster service and you pay for faster service, our service goes at the same speed. If other people pay for slower service or even faster than ours, then they get the speed that they pay for. That is another vision of net neutrality. And by the way, quality of service contracts are already in place. They're not unusual. And current internet protocols actually allow the packets to be sent with the quality of service indicator, which may or may not be honored depending on whether the agreements are in place between transmitting networks. Yet another version of net neutrality is whether there is neutrality between applications. So search from any company would be treated the same way, or video from any company would be treated the same way. And I think that's one of the issues that people worry about when they worry about losing neutrality is they're worried that new startups, like new search engines, would have trouble competing against existing incumbents. But if you do that, of course, then there is a question, is the network also neutral depending on the type of data, between applications? So can networks discriminate between the way they handle video, all video, and the way they handle email, for example? So in order to have a really good debate, we need to appreciate that there is more than one definition of network neutrality. And depending on which definition you favor, you will implicate the values that Charlie mentioned in different ways. You'll be asking questions about where do you value innovation? Do you value application innovation, or do you value network infrastructure innovation? Do you value investment in network infrastructure more than you value application innovation or investment? Depending on how you answer those questions, you will come down in a different place on net neutrality.
So, Blair, maybe you could tell us what's the state of the law in the sense of this net neutrality? I mean, there was a policy back in 2005 that listed 4 principles. Maybe I'll just go through those, and then you can tell us where we are. Access lawful internet content. The people should be able to access lawful internet content of their choice, run applications and use services of their choice, subject to the law, connect to their choice of legal devices that do not harm the network, and benefit from competition among network, application, service, and content providers. So that was really under the Michael Powell FCC, and then Julius Janikowski's Open Internet Order added elements of transparency, requiring that there be transparency, that there be no blocking So when we get to can a carrier block a company of its choice, as we're seeing actually, frankly, with Amazon right now on how they're treating some of their suppliers, or no unreasonable discrimination, and no unreasonable discrimination. Those were the elements that they added in the open internet order. Maybe you could tell us where we stand right now on net neutrality as essentially as a legal matter.
Well, since I'm on a panel with at least 3 people who are much, much better lawyers than I am, I'm a little reluctant, and I hope they correct me if I get this wrong. But I'd like to approach it as an historian rather than a legal matter, for reasons that will become obvious when I tell the punchline. So Michael, so this issue started, I actually, much to my regret, wrote a piece before Tim Wu wrote about it, but I called it The Edge versus the Network, because when I was on Wall Street talking about this issue in 2002, Tim is much better at branding things than I am, so congratulations to him. But the fundamental thing that I saw was the economic battle between the edge and the network, which is, by the way, a very common battle. It's happened lots of other times. Tim wrote about it in Master Switch. Lots of people on this panel have been involved with that. And Michael Powell reacted by suggesting that we have these principles. Then, interestingly, there was an incident involving Madison River, a telephone company in North Carolina that essentially blocked Vonage calls from going through. Powell said that's wrong, and Madison River folded. Moving forward to the Kevin Martin era, there was an incident involving Comcast, but at that point it's just principles, there's no rules. Then Comcast did something, and how you would characterize it is a subject of some debate, but did something that, let's just call it not net neutral in terms of how they treated data, involving BitTorrent. Kevin acted. There was both a commission action and a court proceeding, but Comcast changed their behavior. Then we moved to Julius's time. Julius decided that it was important to establish a series of rules. That came up, though, I think, if I remember my history right, before they acted upon that, a couple things. One, there was an incident involving, I think, Apple and your company, where there was a series of letters and behavior was changed, but there was no litigation or proceeding. Did I remember this right? Apple and AT&T, something? Do I remember this?
Yes.
It doesn't matter.
It was Skype.
It might have been Skype. And I think you were still at Skype at the time. And then there was an adoption. There was a proposed order. But then in February of 2010, there was a legal argument regarding the previous Comcast case, and an April decision came down saying the FCC did not have authority to act against Comcast under what is called Title I, which affects information services. And there are really 2 sets of issues. One is, what is the jurisdiction for FCC action? A Title I theory, which is under information services, or a Title II theory, which is common carriage. There's huge issues about those 2 things, which were made in some sense more difficult by the court, because what the most recent court decision was saying, you don't have authority under Title I the way you premised it, but there's this other section called Section 706, which is kind of like it, and maybe you have authority there. So there's both. You might think of it as, we haven't decided yet on what the foundation of the house should be, nor have we decided on what the architecture of the house should be. But other than that, there's a lot of clarity. But let me close by saying, to me, the really interesting aspect of this, Michael Powell acted without any legal authority whatsoever. By the way, Libertelli was working for him at the time, and I think Chris actually did this. And it worked. Madison River changed their behavior. Kevin Martin acted without any legal authority to stop Comcast from doing something, and it worked. Comcast changed their behavior. Julius acted through a series of letters without any legal authority, and I think, if I recall correctly, got them to change their behavior. Different people can interpret that history in different ways, but my point is, in each case, you've had a chair, each case where this issue has arisen, you've had a chair acting successfully, yet without really the legal authority to do it, and I just think that's an interesting way of looking at the history. But where it stands now, is the FCC is once again trying to figure out both what is the legal foundation, Title I or Title II, or Section 706 or Title II, and then once you've established the legal authority, what should the House actually look like?
So Section 706, this general section that says you have authority, sort of, kind of a general authority that the courts have indicated are
Well,
possible.
I wouldn't classify Section 706 as a general authority. It does
Okay.
provide some jurisdiction for certain kinds of actions. I think there will be tremendous debate over what the limits of 706 are. And by the way, you know, there's one thing that I'm not really a very good lawyer anymore. I'm not sure I was 20 years ago. But let's put it this way. As bad a lawyer as I am, John Oliver is a worse lawyer. He is a much better comedian, but there have been so many misstatements about what the legal limits of Title I and Title II are. I'm pretty sure I'm accurate in saying that the proponents of Title II authority exaggerate what it can do, and the opponents of Title II authority also exaggerate what it can do, so at least they agree on that.
So what I'm going to do is put off the discussion of Title I versus Title II. I just wanted to explain, because I'm basically going under the assumption that, for the audience that these are kind of arcane concepts, and we're kind of going to a pretty basic level.
Right.
But Title II, I did want to say Title II is common carriage, is the
Right.
rule about common carriage. Generally, the FCC has said, well, these internet services are not common carriers, and so it's thought that these should not be under Title II, but now there's an approach to try to classify them under Title II. We will get into that discussion, but later in the dialogue. First, I wanted to address one other thing, and Anna Maria, I think you would be the right person, which is this area of interconnection and peering. When we'll get to Chris Libertelli, because Chris, Netflix have paid to get a little better connection. But I thought maybe Anna Maria could explain peering. It's a word that when I first heard, I kind of didn't understand, and it's essentially an economic concept. And maybe you could explain that and what's going on with these interconnections, not at the carrier customer level, but behind the scenes to the interconnection part of the carrier. In other words, the back end, the backhaul or whatever.
Okay, so let's say I'm the customer of a very small ISP which does not have a global network, just to make it simple. And when my traffic goes through that little guy's network, he's got to hand it off to someone else to carry it across the globe. And that network will then have to hand it off to someone else and someone else and someone else to complete the circuit. And so all of those networks have to figure out on what basis they want to interconnect with each other. And since there are costs of building and operating networks, how are those costs going to be borne? So the way the system evolved on the internet was that initially you had a small number of networks who, for the most part, carried more or less equivalent amounts of traffic. And they decided that rather than billing each other, they were simply going to, the extent that they were in fact giving each other more or less equal value, they were simply going to, quote, peer, act as peers on what is effectively a barter system. I'll give you my traffic, you take mine, neither one of us bills the other guy, and it'll be fine. And as the internet grew, and we're talking, over 30 years, growing by factors of thousands, more and more networks evolved. You had different levels of traffic being exchanged. You had some networks that were able to reach the whole world, others that were only doing a relatively short circuit. And so you evolved a second concept, which was transit, which is one network pays another in order to not only trade traffic with each other's customers, but with everyone everywhere. So essentially you had two systems, peering, which was free, and then transit, which was free. And these were still originally tier 1 networks, global, and then smaller networks. And you've had more and more networks evolve, and so the system has gotten somewhat more complicated. You've gotten paid peering when you have very different amounts of traffic or very different distances or some other clear differences in value between what's being exchanged, between the costs or whatever. So we've had this system that evolved, and I should say evolved with no regulatory interference, but with these networks cropping up as the traffic grew and as the type of traffic changed. We've gone from what was initially all data to voice over, internet protocol, to massive amounts of video. Most of the internet traffic today is video. 5 years ago, it wasn't. And so the internet with no interference has managed to evolve all of this and to create its own system of exchanging traffic. Some of it paid, the vast majority not paid, a small amount of it with actual contracts for interconnection, most of it done on a handshake basis without even contracts. And that has been, as Charlie mentioned, I've covered telecom for 30 years, the contrast between what was the old equivalent system in the telephone network, access charges within the US and settlements between US carriers and foreigners, is really striking, because that system was rife with litigation, with arbitration, with arbitrage. I mean, it was a system that was broken at every possible level. And in contrast, alongside it came this wonderful, rapidly growing internet that somehow managed to get it all done without regulatory interference.
So that seemed to me to segue, Chris, to Netflix, because she says, "Oh, recently we've gotten a lot of video on the internet, and who's delivering the video? Why don't you?" I've seen some amazing statistics about the growth of Netflix, but you're one, and as I said, you're a proxy for all this different content, including the increasingly video-based content that's now on the web and presumably causing some kind of congestion. Here you are, your customers are saying, why am I paying all this money to Netflix and getting buffering when I'm turning on pulling down one of the titles that think I've paid for?
Right. I just want to say one or two things about Anna's summary and then try to answer your question with a picture. I thought Anna's summary was concise and thoughtful in a way I hadn't heard before, and so I want to say a few things about that, which is there is a plasticity to the term net neutrality. We wouldn't contend otherwise. I think to different people it means different things. But I think, for example, the president was attracted to it and said he would take a back seat to no one on the policy because he thought about, I think, the free speech interests and the notion of a citizen interacting with their government over an open internet. We, as you might expect, prioritize the interests of content creators because that's our business. But I'm going to suggest also that you can harmonize the interest in protecting innovation at the application layer with a preference for facilities-based investment, because we believe one of the reasons people subscribe to the broadband internet is to do things like stream online video. So it's a demand driver for the connections that Jim's company is selling. And I don't think they would contend otherwise. If there's one point of agreement, I think that the ISPs and Netflix agree on that point. But because application layer innovation is so central to this nation's innovation policy, we think it's important for the FCC to use all the available tools at its disposal to protect it. And what I mean by that are really all the available tools. There's, Anna Maria mentioned that there was this notion of a self-regulatory system, these norms that had been built up over the internet. Those are absolutely part of the debate for us. But at the same time, merger conditions and the use of either Title I or Title II sources of authority should also be available to the FCC. And what we don't want to do in the FCC's proceeding on net neutrality is do a lot of really good work in the last mile and create another place for the ISPs to discriminate. And here I'm going to try to draw a quick picture so at least we can have some facts. I'm going to pick on Jim's company just because he's here, not because he deserves to be picked on. But this is a house. Yeah, they're not here. That's easier, right? All right.
Why don't we make it Comcast?
Because David Cohen's bigger than you, Jim. He beat me up.
In many ways.
And so this is a house, and there's mom and dad and two little kids and a dog. And they love the internet. They like to stream video. This is This is AT&T's central office. These are things called co-location arrangements, which are important to know about. And this is Netflix and our CDN, and we interconnect with CDN, Content Delivery Network, a way of getting big internet video files to you if you want them, if you're one of these people. And then over here, this is what Anna Maria was talking about. There are a bunch of whole different companies over here that are people like Akamai and other CDNs, right, and transit providers. That's what she was describing. And the point that we're trying to make is if you're going to have a durable net neutrality policy, if you're going to have a comprehensive one, you have to look at this relationship also, right? Because consumers pay a lot of money for this. We pay a lot of money to drop content at the doorstep of the ISP's network. And all we're really asking is for the ISPs to swing the door open and allow us to respond to a request from one of these customers to stream a video. And for us, this interconnection relationship has become the new choke point, the new place for ISPs to tax content companies. So you could do a lot of good work to protect openness here, but you might just see the discrimination move to this point in the network.
So Jim, you want to swing that door open?
Open the door, Jim.
We don't really have a problem with Netflix today. Honestly, our problem is a DSL base. We're investing dramatically to try and upgrade to speed sufficient to stream that service. I think that the point was made earlier that net neutrality from the start has primarily focused on the last mile and on neutrality within the last mile. As Anna Maria said, and I think Tim sort of said, the internet itself, the middle mile concepts, has always had inequality built into it. And I think that's been widely accepted. Anna Maria pointed out there's always been, exchanges of money for the carriage of traffic, and peering only developed when the exchanges were so equal that people didn't bother sending each other equal amounts of money. And that's still the case today. Netflix pays transit providers to deliver its traffic. I think that part of the problem with the debate has been that people too readily analogize to the phone system because, if you've been involved in telecommunications or even in the internet, it's an easy analogy. And so people talk about gatekeepers in the Bell system and things of this nature where you could really have a problem like that. And I think the fundamental difference is that was one network. And the internet is a network of networks. It involves hundreds, if not thousands, of different means of delivering your traffic. No one at the end point can block, and no one has, but no one can block, an edge provider from reaching a customer. It's all a matter of how they do it and the quality that comes with that. I think. And so you can connect directly, as Netflix clearly wants to do now, except they don't want to pay for the connection. They want to pay zero. They're not paying zero today. Okay, they're using a transit company named Cogent primarily to deliver its traffic. And I think there's been some very good things written on the internet analyzing the Netflix issue. But Cogent is widely known as the cheapest transit company out there. There's a reason they're cheaper and that their quality is lower, okay? And so Netflix makes its own decisions on how it wants to connect. Now, apparently when it did the Comcast deal, and we don't know all the details of that, but based on the reporting, Netflix clearly in its own economic interest decided to save money here. Comcast apparently gave them a direct connection. It's cheaper than what they were doing, or I'm sure they wouldn't have done it. They get a guarantee of quality on the one end, and Comcast gets an assurance that if they invest to add the extra circuits, not only will Netflix, have skin in the game, but that they won't then yank their traffic after they add the circuits to deal with a handoff from Cogent or whoever, and yank their traffic to some other provider and leave them with a stranded investment. Okay, so what you have in microcosm there is how the internet works in terms of interconnection, which is everybody's got a variety of routes to deliver their traffic. All of them cost money, and everybody accepts that, okay? And by the way, the only company out there right now arguing for free is Netflix. There's a reason for that. They're not the only video company, they're not the only streaming video company. Everybody else has made these types of arrangements and has decided how they want to deliver their traffic. Netflix has a variety of choices, just like all of them, to deliver their traffic. They choose certain ways of doing it, and there's money involved. And I don't see, honestly, the validity of an argument where, if on the one hand you're paying Cogent as a transit provider to then connect into a Comcast or an AT&T, why somehow it's right to pay them, but wrong when Cogent is no longer a part of that equation, and you have a direct connection. Now all of a sudden it needs to be free. And that's not ever the way the internet has worked. I think the big difference between the last mile portion of the net neutrality debate and the Netflix version of this is that I think the valid argument on net neutrality in the last mile is that some of the fears that are out there about prioritization of traffic in the last mile, gatekeepers, free speech, things of this nature, are all things that could change the fundamental nature of the internet. That's not something our company wants. We don't support fast lanes, slow lanes. I mean, we're investing more than any other company in America, and all of that investment is going to ensure everyone is on the fast lane. We supported the internet principles you described. We supported the 2010 rule. I worked with Chris in negotiations to try to get there. I was a Democratic witness in the committee hearing defending the rule. We did not challenge it in court. We have vowed to comply with it. We have vowed to continue complying with it even after the Verizon decision came out. We offered to continue doing that. As part of our merger, we've not changed our policies, all of which guarantee that we won't do those kind of things that have been postulated that would change the fundamental nature of the internet. And so I think we have a fundamental agreement on that point. I think the disagreement on the last mile end is okay. So you're okay, but somebody else might not be, and so how do we guard against that? And we can come back to that later. But what Chris is arguing is in fact to take that concept that has been embedded in the last mile and embedded in the entire rest of the internet where it has never been part of how the internet functions. And if he catches the bus on this, and I doubt he will, that would change the fundamental nature of the internet. And I think one has to ask themselves, what is so wrong with the way the internet operates today, with commercial agreements for interconnection, that somehow we need to radically shift that. And by the way, I think damage the type of investment that would otherwise occur.
So I'm going to let Chris respond, but I also, as I do, want to throw out that it does seem to be over 100 tech companies who seem to be coming in on his side. So I wonder, as Chris will respond with what's going on with Netflix, but I wonder, Jim, if this is, can be narrowed down just to a Netflix problem, or is there really something more fundamental going on there between these two basic industries?
I would say this, Charlie. I mean, any company worth their salt, if they're paying for something versus getting it free, it's in their economic interest to at least try and get it for free. It doesn't surprise me any that somebody might weigh in and say, hey, you go for it, Chris. If you can get free, good for you. Okay? But the fact is, somebody has to pay for the transmission of the traffic. Netflix has been paying since inception. It wants free. I get it. Somebody ends up having to pay to carry that traffic and to make the upgrades necessary to carry it. So if we have to make upgrades to carry that traffic, who pays for it if Netflix doesn't? Netflix's answer is that we ought to apportion that across the entire base of our customers, only a fraction of whom use Netflix, by the way, but they all have to pay for the upgrades necessary for the few who use Netflix, versus him taking care of those things as part of the cost of a Netflix subscription.
Let's not get personal. It's not me.
Well, you used AT&T. Just as they did when they delivered a CD to the door, and the cost of the postage was involved.
Let's let Chris
I
back.
take Jim's point. I get where he's coming from on this. We have spent a lot of time talking about this, and I'd rather spend less time. So hopefully this will be the last chapter in the net neutrality debate.
I'll take the other side of that debate.
That's unlikely.
The other side of that bet.
Yeah, exactly. But come back. Just 3 quick points. On the Comcast deal, let's just call a spade a spade. What was happening was Comcast was congesting pathways into their network so they could charge us and other CDNs for access to their network and to their eyeballs. When we saw that degradation of performance happening to Netflix consumers, we found it intolerable. So we paid our way around congestion. That's what we did. We didn't buy a fast lane, we paid our way around congestion, thing one. Point two, Jim makes it out like, you know, they're going to be digging up the streets and rolling trucks and stranded circuit investments. What we're talking about is swinging the door open. We're talking about something that's called a port on the back of a router. Moore's law has made those routers less and less expensive over time. That's why when you run a deep fiber network, there are fewer maintenance costs, you get better economics. That's where the future is driving towards. And the additional cost of adding capacity is almost unmeterable. It is so low that to send a bill for it would cost you more to generate the bill than it would be to charge for it. So what we're really saying is that silicon economics create the economic conditions for the right answer to be a zero cost interconnect. And here's my final point. If we don't do this, if Jim is successful and his other ISPs are successful at creating a system of access charge, I guarantee you we'll be back here because it will attract regulation. We'll be back here in 10 or 15 years talking about how those access charges have attracted regulation just as they did in the long distance wars of the 80s. And so to avoid a retrans style system where they turn the internet into more of a cable television system and we have to figure out who's got the right economic power to balance out the terminating access monopoly, it seems to us it would be better in the context of all these mergers to develop the right answer, which is squeeze the money out of the interconnect relationship and let consumers choose what they want based on the best product, not the value and the cost of these interconnection deals.
You can't take the charges in the exchanges of money for the transmission of traffic that have existed since the start of the internet and are the way traffic is handled across the entire internet today, relabel them access charges, and make what is the fundamental way the internet functions and handles traffic somehow some new thing. Okay, these aren't access charges.
These are access charges.
Well, let's let Tim in. Who's
Sure. So I have a few comments. First of all, I mean, we've already heard that the norm for many of these relationships is settlement-free peering. So to say that, you know, since the beginning of the internet it's all been paid, that's as you just said, the history of the telephone network.
When they're in balance.
When they're in balance, right? But I'm just saying there has been a long history of settlement-free peering. So it's not as if I have a few comments on what is really the interconnection debate. One thing I would stress is I think there's interconnection and then there's interconnection. There's a difference when the networks we're talking about are somewhere in the middle of the internet. There are multiple ways to get through to the final goal. And when the interconnection concerns a termination point, that is, when what is being offered is to terminate the service. I know this is getting very complicated, but what I'm suggesting is when you have a company, and I'll choose Comcast instead of AT&T or anyone else, who has, let's say, 20 million customers, the only way to reach that customer is through Comcast. And therefore, it has long been understood that they have what is described as a terminating monopoly to that customer. That gives them a dangerous position to extract too much from the rest of the network. The only way, if you were everyone in this room, as you probably soon will be, maybe one day, all Comcast customers, the only way to reach each of you is to go through Comcast. So then, when any company, not just Netflix, comes and wants to reach these customers, they face this challenge that is the only way to reach them, and therefore, in theory, Comcast can charge whatever price they want to reach those customers.
Aren't you
And that's
saying
a different
that?
yeah, go ahead.
Are you saying that Comcast has no competition? Because
Yes.
you're basically saying, oh, okay, so that's what you're saying.
for those individual customers.
For their own customers,
For-
but
for
you can
those-
say that about any company who has a customer relationship. For those customers, that's their,
Right. That-
they have a monopoly on their customers
And this-
because they're their customers.
Well, I mean, it has to depend with the switching costs, but this has actually been the long-standing principle by which the telephone network was regulated. Because when you were trying to reach a customer who, let's say, was on AT&T's line or so forth, the local carrier, the only way to reach them was from them. And so they always realized that for long-distance carriers, there'd be the danger of charging exorbitant prices. And there's a record of charging exorbitant prices. So from the perspective of someone who's trying to reach a Comcast customer, and the Comcast customer has no idea that people are trying to reach them and having to pay these extra fees unless they somehow get alerted, Comcast has the position of a situational monopoly. This is an old common law concept. I'll give you, it relates to the idea, the original justifications for common carriage, which had to do with being stuck in the middle of the wilderness and there being one innkeeper, and you need to stay there, otherwise you get killed by bandits, and then they have the position where they can charge you whatever they want. So there is a different kind of monopoly power at issue when we have interconnection into a terminating monopoly. That's what's at issue here, and that's why I think the FCC will probably end up acting on this issue based on the history of abuse of this
Larry,
area.
you've thought about competition at the terminal level, if you will, and you've advocated for gigabit connectivity. Do you see this the same way Tim does?
Well, first of all, I would not characterize the market structure as a monopoly. I think it's interesting, and it's not the same as the competitive dynamic you have for, say, restaurants in DuPont Circle, but I wouldn't characterize it as a monopoly.
It's a difference between saying the market is a monopoly and saying there is a termination.
Terminating access monopoly,
Terminating access
which
monopoly.
I agree with you
Right.
to the
Those
extent
are
that we're
different
talking
ideas.
about that.
Yeah.
I have a somewhat contrarian point of view from pretty much everyone that goes to the gigabit thing, but it's partly about market structure, but it's really about something different, which is the debate over 706 Title I versus Title II kind of reminds me of Woody Allen noting that mankind was at a crossroad, one path leading to utter hopelessness and despair, the total to complete annihilation. Let us hope we have the wisdom to choose wisely. Either the 706 path, that's a path of litigation, and Title II is a path of enormous litigation, and this will take years. And that's why I would take the other side of the bet. I think there'll be another panel here and 20 other think tanks 5 or 10 years from now. Because this fundamental issue of the relationship between content and distribution exists in every medium, and it gets debated, and regulation plays a role. But the interesting thing to me is that both sides, and this goes to the values question we're talking about, if you talk about what values are at stake here, both sides are effectively saying the same thing, which is that we are concerned about lack of innovation that comes from lack of investment into networks. Both sides are articulating that if there is a lack of bandwidth or a lack of investment into bandwidth, there can be problems down the road. And my point would be, while this debate is going on for another decade, why don't we just, some of us off in the distance and sometimes in the wilderness, focus on getting just a lot more bandwidth into the system?
Yes.
Not because that eliminates the problem, but because it tremendously mitigates the problem. It was not noted by, any major paper, but yesterday Jim's company struck a deal with the city of Winston-Salem to bring a gigabit of connectivity into that city, following up a deal they struck with 5 other North Carolina communities a few months ago in a project that I'm involved in. The Google stuff is well known. I was in Champaign-Urbana a week and a half ago. There's a lot of activity where mayors are saying, for the future of our community, we just are going to need a lot more bandwidth. How do we do it? And instead of trying to dictate, they're actually in negotiations with Google, with AT&T. I think about 100 communities you're now talking
about
to.
100.
We'll see whether local government forces can drop the cost of deployment to the extent in which this matters. And by the way, the reason why the competition element works to this, I would just note, if you look at a Wall Street Journal story of January last year, the CEO of Cox said, we aren't going to upgrade to a gig because it will cost billions and billions of dollars. 2 weeks ago, Cox announced they're going to be putting a gig into their entire territories, though only starting in those communities where either Google or CenturyLink has already announced that they're interested in putting a gig. The CEO of Time Warner said customers don't want faster bandwidth. A couple weeks ago, Time Warner announced that they are tripling the speeds of their networks at no additional cost. So basically every tier suddenly gets a 3x on speed. But by the way, in communities where there are either community or Google is going. My point being that I think the path of getting a lot more bandwidth is a doable path. It is not it's not unrelated to this debate, but all investment, as Anna Marie knows, as Jim knows, everyone on this panel knows, there are multiple factors that affect it. And if we can find a path to getting much more significant bandwidth, that doesn't mean the debate goes away entirely. It just means it's not as big an issue and Chris's videos will get delivered in really beautiful 8K surround sound,
8K.
wonderful stuff. So we can always look forward to that.
So Anna Marie,
Can I just add
Yeah.
briefly to this? And it's not just that the bandwidth expansion helps, but also different kinds of access help. So it used to be that you had cable and you had landline, and you were done. You now have wireless as well. And so even though companies there are a limited number of companies that run wires into my house, if I have wireless, I have a much, much bigger choice than I did before.
It depends what the use case is. I don't think for today, for
Right.
Netflix, wireless is an economic option. I also don't think it's a quality option. That may change. I mean, certainly Sprint
And it has
is
changed over
We're-
time.
We're aiming to change it.
You're aiming
Yeah.
to change it. Sprint's
Yeah.
aiming to change it. Artemis Networks is changing. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, but
Um,
people have been talking about that for about 15 years, and I'm waiting. Like, you know, people have been saying we're about to have wireless. It's going to be the, you know, compete.
what
And
about the satellite,
And then
direct
you look
satellite?
at the actual penetration. It's like 1%, 2% of people who use. I mean, the numbers are not there.
but what
I mean,
about
and
direct
I
satellite?
think like mythological competition can't replace
Well, we're
real
actually.
competition. I mean, if you
if-
can tell
if
me
I-
a number
I
that's
can
of
tell you,
national.
I can tell you a number right now. We're filing at the FCC today. It's 13 million fixed wireless local loop customers that would have high-speed internet access, mostly in rural areas where we have the available spectrum. We need a 10 by 2, 20 megahertz to make it work. But we think we can reach, and we're telling the FCC that in the filing today. 13 million customer locations, the bulk of which are actually outside our wireline footprint, and we're actually delineating where. So,
I mean, I think all of us would like to see competition wireless. I'm just saying it's been for the last I've been in this industry for at least 15 years, and I've heard it's kind of this sort of ghost that's always about to appear and change everything. And it's dangerous to have a debate about sort of projected conditions. Well, anyway, go ahead.
But, well, in a way, a lot of the net neutrality debate is on projected conditions. It's the other direction.
Charlie,
Go ahead.
we're talking, first of all, let me just say that I agree with Blair and Anna and everyone else that we want all the bandwidth we can get, and we want investment to get that. But we also need to recognize that companies are not putting content right now on the internet that requires anywhere near that. And one of the more striking things, I guess, that I have found was on Netflix site, looking at the Netflix speed test, which shows the speed at which Netflix runs on ISPs all over the world. And the
You mean
fastest...
the speed index?
The index,
Yeah.
excuse me. And the fastest speed anywhere in the world, according to Netflix, is less than 4 megabits per second. And that's on Google Fiber, and that's on fiber throughout Scandinavia. It's anywhere at all. So they, whatever decisions ISPs may have made about what speed they want or don't want to run, the best they can get is 4, because that's what's coming in from Netflix, which has made its own decisions about the economics of its network before it gets to the ISPs.
Just to clarify that, that's what's necessary to do a high-definition video. It's not that there's any need for any. You could imagine an 8K video or 4K video needing more, but the 4 is what you need to deliver a high-definition stream.
But that's a speed you can run on almost any network that's running right now, I guess.
Right, and that's the problem, is that conceptually, those networks should deliver that 4 megabits, but what we're seeing is they don't. Even though consumers are paying for 20 and 50 megabits, they're not receiving sufficient throughput to actually get to 4.
And can I also, in some sense, it's a small point. On the other hand, it's a really big point. Up here, we all want more bandwidth, but there is a group of people who don't, and that's Wall Street. And what I mean, and Anna Marie and I both work for Wall Street, they want dividends. They don't want investment. That's one of the great myths we have in this town, that Wall Street really wants this or that. They want dividends. They want kind of a return on capital. And the problem that we saw, and we saw this in the National Broadband Plan, and it was the purpose, frankly, of both Google Fiber and the Gig.U project, is to try to figure out how to change the math sufficiently to enable that investment. Because in the moment of the fall of 2009, Jim's company would have been insane to announce the kind of thing that they've announced, that they were talking to cities about investing, because Wall Street would have killed them as it killed Verizon for their Fios investment.
I'd like to go to sort of who pays, and I think in the end it's always the customer ends up paying. So there was an earlier debate between Jim and Chris on who does it cost? How, do you get it free? Frankly, as I see it, either Jim says, well, they want everybody to pay. So what you're really saying is it's part of the cost of subscribing to the ISP, the internet service provider, or basically the carrier. But you would like to see it placed on Netflix, who in turn would put it on their customer. Essentially, the question is, do you pay for it? Does the customer end up paying for it in their subscription price,
Right.
or in their subscription price?
Well, and more to the point, which customers pay? I mean, if the expense is a result of Netflix traffic, then should AT&T charge its entire customer base, even if they may not be using Netflix? Or should Netflix pass the cost to their customer base, which just as they did, again, when they delivered the discs to the door through the U.S. mail. I mean, their neighbors didn't pay the postage. And
I guess that's
so I'm curious what your
yeah, that's
response
one
is.
of the maybe there's a place of agreement here in there somewhere, but we only respond to consumer requests, right? Somebody clicks on the Netflix site, they ask for a movie or a television show, and we send it. So I think sometimes when you hear the ISPs talk, it was the notion that we're sort of flooding the network with traffic. All we're doing is responding to the requests of our joint customer. So yes, we're 33% of peak load traffic, but it's every one of those megabits is because somebody's requested something on the internet.
I think there's a fallacy there, though, and that is that look, what we're offering the customer is a best efforts internet connection at a specific speed that, at least in the parts of the connection that we can control, which is the last mile, and the ability to reach any website of their choice. The quality of the video you get from any website varies dramatically. I mean, I've got a pretty good connection at home, and you can go to one site and it's fine, and you go to another site and it stalls out. It all depends on the investments that those websites have made, because my connection's pretty solid, and so we're not the ones that promise a Netflix customer a specific level of service, HD quality or Ultra HD quality, in terms of the video streaming service that we offer. They're the ones making those promises. We offer the connection, okay? The quality of that connection is entirely within the hands of Netflix. They're the ones that makes the promise to the customer about the level of quality they expect with a Netflix subscription, and why it streams faster than some routine site on the website. And they're the ones that should be making the investment, to ensure that promise is kept, not AT&T and other AT&T customers that have nothing to do with Netflix.
And that's why we invested in a global content delivery to drop bits off at Jim's
Right.
doorstep.
Right?
Can I
You wanna
just
go
ask,
both?
well, I have a question for Chris.
Yes.
Are you proposing that every time your customer clicks, they agree to a 5 cent or 1 cent or a fraction of a penny, whatever the right number is, payment for that traffic, so that the non-Netflix users are not cross-subsidizing? I mean, I just don't understand the point you were making.
I was trying to, what I think is underneath what Jim was saying is that who's the cost causer, and therefore who should recover the cost. And what I was suggesting is that in that case, it's the consumer who requested the video that's the cost causer.
So,
Right.
but if they're
And
paying
I'm not
this-
proposing a micro-payment system that would partition things out. What I am suggesting is that Jim's argument is this, I'm sorry to go after, the ISP's arguments are somehow Netflix imposes a disproportionate cost on these broadband facilities that we need Netflix to pay for. That's exactly the same argument that the local exchange carriers made to the long distance companies, that they've got these costs that need to be recovered through the inter-carrier system. And that turned into a 15, 20-year regulatory battle that I think we should avoid. And I guess I would finally say that there aren't costs that aren't being recovered. All the ISPs get huge margins on their internet access service. It's not as if consumers aren't paying a lot for internet access. This is about them getting an additional revenue source at wholesale, which I'm sure they would like, but may not be good for innovation throughout the ecosystem.
But Chris,
Well,
that payment,
let's, and before you, Tim, I've had a question, it may feed into what you're going to say, may not. People have talked about the cableization of the internet. And in a way, you know, it's interesting because cable, it started off when the cable had just a few channels. And in a way, they would extract ownership of the channels in order to carry it. Or certainly, you know, people at times would pay. Now you turn around and the cable operators are paying the content companies in order. So I'm just wondering, these are sort of two-sided markets, and are there incentives here to lead towards a cableization, and what does that mean even if by saying it?
You know, cableization is a great word. And I have to give you credit for coming up with that. Something that happens in the American economy sometimes is that sectors of the economy become consumed by pricing wars. And pricing wars and pricing disagreements, probably the best example of this is healthcare, where it seems like an enormous amount of the health is insurers and hospitals and doctors. And that itself becomes a drag on the national economy. And when you compare the internet and the cable networks, born approximately the same time, they invented approximately the same time, they've had a very different history. The most attractive part about the internet is that it has avoided most of the particular battles, ongoing transaction costs as to who is going to be paid who for each tiny little thing. Most of it just happens. You know, I have my own website. It's terrible, but I've never. It's rotten, but it's there.
Good.
So I am a content provider, timwoo.org. And it's terrible, but luckily I've never had to negotiate with anyone about what kind of price to get it on. Compare that to the cable network. If I'd wanted to start a cable channel, I mean, who can start a cable channel? It's just you don't even know how to start it. And then who would pay who and how much, it would be a disaster. And this is what has been the advantage of the internet, is that it has lower costs of entry, less barriers to entry, because there's a lot of stuff just doesn't have to happen. It just kind of has been assumed to work. And I give the engineers credit for this, because if it had been designed by lawyers or other people, there would have been a lot more pricing battles. And so part of what net neutrality can be understood as, and I acknowledge here again there's so many definitions, is it's sort of a truce on pricing. It avoids and excludes a whole bunch of pricing disputes by setting the prices at zero. You know, as I said, my crappy site, the cost I pay to, let's say, Comcast to reach its customers is zero. I've never had any dealings with them, and we don't have to, and the transaction costs are zero, and it is much more efficient that way. And what I'm nervous about with all these access fee charges and efforts and saying who should pay who is that we will have the cableization, and what I define as the cableization is every time someone wants to get on the internet, it starts with a complicated debate as to who should pay who, and often we don't know who should pay who. Should AT&T pay Google? Should Google pay AT&T? You know, we've ignored these questions and just said they're zero. We're not going to answer them, and I'm afraid we're going to get into that, and then in the end, the internet's going to look like some combination of the healthcare industry and the cable industry. And if that's not a Frankenstein, I don't know what is.
Anna Marie?
well, I'm not sure exactly how much traffic your website drives, Tim, but I think it's a
Nothing.
safe bet. It's considerably less than what Netflix imposes.
I hope so.
Well,
Trouble.
You'd concede
so
that?
I think what we need to keep in mind is that the way as I described earlier, the way the internet has in fact worked extremely effectively is when there is a huge imbalance of traffic, such as Netflix is causing, then it's not free. There is an exchange of payment for carrying that traffic. That's been the history of it. It's done through commercial agreements, generally handshake agreements. It's not been an issue. It's not access charges. It's not the regime that I think all of us here found pretty horrible in the traditional networks.
Jim, why don't you have an incentive just to lower the service to companies that can pay, like Netflix or Google or whatever, and then extract some payments from them? Isn't there
lower
just sort of a
Well,
business incentive?
Maintain scarcity.
What Chris described earlier in the Comcast situation, I mean, I don't know the facts and all that, but I mean, I mean, I'd step back and say if that occurred, it's truly wrong. It's not something our company would engage in. I think, and I think it's the type of thing that you could certainly, bring an action against the company for doing if they're intentionally degrading the traffic. If, however, Chris is dumping something on Comcast that he says, okay, here it is, it's all HD quality, and all of a sudden, by the way, at peak hours, it's 30% of all internet traffic, okay? So keep in mind, this is a massive thing. And the expectation is then Comcast, from the point it's dropped off to the customer, has to make massive investments in order to ensure that it continues to be HD quality all the way through to the customer. Then obviously that's a service they're providing to Netflix customers, and for Netflix. And historically, and with every other video provider, by the way, and even with Netflix, because it has commercial agreements, that is something two companies get together and negotiate. And by the way, the money doesn't all flow one way; it's mutual. I don't know the terms of the deal with Comcast or Verizon, but I am familiar with some deals of this nature, and the reality is that the investments that the ISP makes at its end are significantly larger than the money contributed for those investments by Netflix, okay? But it gives them skin in the game to ensure the same type of quality all the way through. So they're partners, and these are negotiated through companies. This is the way the internet works today, especially with regard to video, which upset the traditional peering arrangements where traffic was roughly in balance. Video is massively unbalanced. And so I think everyone has recognized that both parties to this transaction have an interest in ensuring that the customer, that the mutual customer is happy at the end of the day. But they also recognize if investment is required, that there's some mutuality there too. And so I think our argument is that this has always worked historically through commercial arrangements, okay? There hasn't been an instance where it hasn't been worked out that way, okay? Customers have not been hurt in any fashion by some, you don't have these failures to agree, and there's always other ways to reach these customers. Netflix avails themselves of a multitude of different ways to reach its customers today. It's not just any one way. And so this is almost an if it ain't broke, don't fix it thing. I think that the notion that somehow something is broken here when it clearly isn't, and that the government should then intervene, impose pricing regulation on all of these arrangements, interconnection arrangements that constitute the internet today, I think is a fundamental shift in how the internet operates, and it's unwarranted.
So let's get to what kind of regulation would be ideal or best.
Can I just preface
Sure.
that conversation by saying my only disagreement with Jim is when you say something is broken. I'm not sure it's the internet part of all this or the delivery. I think it's the regulatory piece, and by that I don't mean necessarily at the FCC. I'm just saying that if you've spent 10 years debating the same thing over and over again, expecting to actually resolve anything,
Okay,
that
never
may be
mind.
broken.
Don't forget my
but
question.
yes, let's discuss it.
Well, I think one of a couple of things we could say is that essentially the blocking. I think everybody agrees, and I'll just sort of throw this out. Everybody agrees, I think, that a company should not be able to block some site, some access. I mean, that's okay.
Well, that's not entirely true.
Okay, go
Because
ahead.
in fact, ISPs do block things, and we love them for it. They block spam, they block malware, and nobody wants that to stop. So I think we need to be a little bit careful
Okay.
No, blocking is
about
legal.
what,
Yeah, yeah,
you know,
I think
about how
it's-
we talk about this.
Yeah, I think I mean, actually, there was a definition in the 2010 rule. I think the definitions all survived. But yeah, it's legal websites, and frankly, but for reasons of reasonable network management. And so, yeah, you clearly want to
but-
filter out malware. You're obligated by the Justice Department to block certain child porn sites, for example, on their list and things like that.
But that, of course, has to be part of the regulatory regime because who decides?
Sure,
Right?
sure,
You know,
sure.
Amazon goes in and decides to
Yeah.
yank a whole bunch of books for copyright reasons or
Yeah.
because they have some kind of content that they don't like. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And when we're talking about allowing ISPs greater control over what consumers access, are we also talking about wading into that whole territory and figuring out how those kinds of decisions get made?
And one of the things that you've argued for and about is privacy. That when they come in and do the deep packet inspection and that kind of thing, that jeopardizes some of the subscribers' privacy. Is that an element of this net neutrality issue?
It would be, and in fact, the net neutrality debate to some extent is enabled by distance of deep packet inspection. If you can't tell one kind of traffic from another kind of traffic, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It's the fact that somebody can look inside the packet and differentiate a movie from an email that enables differential routing. But it also potentially enables other things. It enables ISPs to potentially reconstruct emails or video conversations or voice conversations. They do some of that to comply with CALEA. They may be able to do some of that for marketing purposes or other purposes. And when the privacy community and the NGOs talk about some of the downsides of losing net neutrality, this is what they're talking about. This is what they're concerned about. They're concerned about ISPs inspecting content and then using what they learn from those inspections for purposes that consumers may not anticipate and may not be happy with.
So that gets to a second rule, which is transparency. Again,
Right.
probably something that everybody here favors is a certain level of transparency. But Anna, does that run afoul of any of your concerns?
Well, transparency is wonderful if it comes with choice, right? If the only thing you get is a notice that says, this is what we're doing, take it or leave it, and you have no other choices, so you can't leave it, it's nice to know what's being done, but it doesn't really help entirely. So I'm a big proponent of transparency, but it has to be accompanied by real choice, not a take it or leave it kind of proposition.
And let me get to the third element that was added in the 2010 proceeding, which is no unreasonable discrimination. And that, I think, it gets to be what is reasonable discrimination? I think that's what Chairman Wheeler got into a little bit of either, in his mind, misunderstanding or trouble or whatever, because people perceived that his attempts at defining that was going to somehow or another undermine the net. Well, I shouldn't speak for him or really describe it, but Tim, I think you've been certainly a strong proponent in this area. What's your view of this no unreasonable discrimination? Where does that go?
First of all, it's impossible, although it sort of seems ideal to say, well, we should have a completely discrimination-free internet. That seems like ideal. It's not really possible to do that for a number of reasons. There are bandwidth concerns, or some of the blocking for malware, child pornography we're already talking about. So already there's some. So the debate ends up where we end up with so many of legal rules, like things like housing discrimination or other things, which are what are unreasonable and what are reasonable forms of discrimination. And that's where I think you end up with. And there are different ways in which a carrier could discriminate that I think most people would think are reasonable. I'll give one example of what I would consider reasonable. If it was possible, setting aside the privacy concerns, and maybe they shouldn't be, but if it was if you could detect whether what was at issue was a video traffic or email traffic, and you decide to treat video traffic better and email traffic worse, without any regard to the identity of the traffic at all, just try to give your customers a better experience, that would strike me as a reasonable form of discrimination. The problem is that there are many unreasonable forms of discrimination that come up very quickly. There's a natural incentive. I'll pick on Comcast again. If you have most of your revenue coming, if not profit, most of your revenue coming from video, and you see that more and more people are interested in internet video, which seems a lot cheaper, you have a natural interest in discriminating against that, making sure it's never quite as good as your video. And we talked about Madison River back in the day. Why would a phone company want a company like Skype or Vonage to be on their network? It doesn't make sense. You make more money by discriminating against them. So there's very obviously bad forms of discrimination. And then you get somewhere in the middle, and that's where things get very challenging.
Okay, let me just, we didn't invite Comcast, we invited AT&T, but I feel a little bad. I will say this, that
Am I supposed to
Comcast-
defend them, or?
Yeah, you should defend. But, well, I'll defend them in this point, which is that they actually are the only company, as I understand it, who's actually obligated to net neutrality rules under their consent agreements or their conditions to merge with NBC Universal. And then, of course, they're facing another possible.
That's partially correct. Okay, I mean they have made they did make that commitment in the NBCU merger, and it is enforceable against them. But the transparency rules survived the court decision. All of us were required to file transparency filings on our website, statements of network. I can't remember practices or something like that. That with respect to the 2010 rule, including, by the way, the parts of the rule that the court invalidated. Okay, and so none of us have changed those. AT&T still has it on our website. You know, I put in the blog, and we don't intend to change it. I mean, and, you know, and so we know that binds us to the old pre-Verizon case standard. Okay. And I don't think it's arguable that if we violated our own policy practices that we post on our website pursuant to a valid rule, that the FCC could proceed against us, and probably the Federal Trade Commission too. So in that sense, I think and I think that's true of all the major ISPs today. I don't think anybody's changed their sites to the best of my knowledge.
So here's something I've always wondered about, and this is a genuine question for Jim. Because we worked on the 2010 order, which included a ban on paid priority. If you're saying that you agree to the 2010 order, are you also promising that you wouldn't do these last mile priority deals? Or
yeah, I mean, I said in a blog Friday that we have no desire, plan, or intention to do anything of that nature. I think Blair makes a good point. We don't first, you know, we don't think the idea of fast lanes, slow lanes is a good idea. Okay, we think the better investment for us to make is in these increases in capacity to everybody. I think that the only scenario in which I think you end up, and we don't think there's a business there, by the way, either. I don't know what you'd sell, and our guys can't figure it out either. We've committed to that. Just to finish the point, I think the only danger of fast lanes, slow lanes developing is in a situation of scarcity, where you're effectively having to ration capacity through price, which is the point I think you were making, Blair, earlier. So I think Blair's absolutely right that if our assurances on this aren't sufficient, okay, and we are willing to be bound to a standard along the lines of the 2010 rule. I supported it in testimony in 2010. I'm not going to say now 4 years later somehow we're going to act different to that. But I think the real point is that we ought to be doing everything we can to incent the continuing investments in capacity. I mean, our company alone has invested like $125 billion in capital over the last 5 years, most of it going to things like this. We've announced new investments as we go. And if we were to radically change the regulatory structure for those investments by, instead of using a 706 approach, introducing Title II or something of this nature, it would have an incredible chilling effect on those investments going forward. And it could bring about the very dangers that people are most worried about, which is the development of fast lanes, slow lanes. The only way, in my view, that happens is if the investment dries up, the capacity it doesn't continue to increase at the levels it is today, and you end up having effectively to ration capacity by price. And so I think Blair's formula is exactly the right one. That's where we should focus.
We're going to go to the audience in a second, but I do have one question on that, Jim, and I can't resist. And then I'm going to go to Tim and then to the audience. And that is, you in your blog said that Title II would not actually prevent this kind of, it really wouldn't change anything. Why would, if that's the case, which you've said, why would it change the ability to invest in networks?
Well, it does all sorts of other bad things when you label all of these services they're not subject to Title II and common carriage rules today. You know, common carriage, for one thing, it subjects all these services to PUC oversight. It means you got to get FCC permission to introduce a new service or take one down. I mean, you know, the filings, the expenses. I mean, it is a regulatory structure designed in 1934 for a Bell system monopoly. It's not suited to the 21st century.
Okay, Anna Marie has a quick point, and then Tim, and then we go out.
It's really a follow-up to the last thing Jim said. If you change the definition of an information service to bring in broadband, you're changing it in a way that could bring in Netflix as a platform on which people simply transmit communication. You open the world for pretty much every Google service to be on there. You open the world for their imitators to be on there. This would wind up being litigated for, I don't know, 5 to 10 years. And investors are not going to sit around and wait the 5 or 10 years. What they're going to do is, on day one, they're going to walk out. And depending on who wins at the end, they'll come back. But during that period, this is, I guess, what people generally call uncertainty. Investors don't tolerate uncertainty. They have an awful lot of other choices all around the world. And so if you bring in 706, the FCC has a tremendous amount of discretion about what it does and does not actually do. Okay. If you bring in Title II has all this language. It has all sorts of state jurisdiction. It has all sorts of stuff that not only would affect the guys who are used to it, but would affect everyone else.
Okay.
And that's why investors would leave.
Okay, so Tim,
Yeah, sure.
and then we're going to go on out to the
I'll
other.
just say, well, all that would be true, minus a little simple word called forbearance, which we have now somehow got
It's
skipped on
not
that.
simple and it's not little.
There's a little
Our
word called
experience-
forbearance, which wasn't mentioned in that description. But anyway, I want to
So
talk about
just-
something else. I have a completely different topic than Title
Okay,
II.
so let me just say,
Yeah.
forbearance is, so there is this regime of common carriage. Forbearance allows the government not to impose the full extent of that regime.
And then people
the-
come in and litigate
And-
item by item.
The FCC can change its mind on forbearance at any time, and I got the experience with forbearance that our industry has had, and we're still subject to Title II and a number of areas, has not been a good one.
Okay, Tim, next
But
point.
I have the point, so you had listed and described the sort of norms that have developed over the last 10 years. And I think our discussion about interconnection, actually, and some of the things Jim said, reveal that a new norm is forming. And it applies to this interconnection context. And it has to do not so much with discrimination or with blocking, but with degradation threats. Mm-hmm. And I think what people are concerned, I think when you really boil down, like what seems like the bad behavior that we're worried about now, it isn't so much blocking. I agree with you that nobody is blocking in ways they used to in the early 2000s. And I agree with you that the sort of pernicious, I'm going to choose Yahoo as the best search engine in the world and leave everyone else behind. That isn't happening. But what is happening are degradation threats. Or at least there's some evidence to degrade, which is to say, hand it over or see your service not be what your consumers want it to be and have them blame you. So I just want to suggest that I think is the focus of this discussion. That's what bubbles up.
So one of the things that always worried me was if you have data caps, essentially, and the company would have an incentive to lower and lower the incentive caps, then charge other companies to come in and not be part of those data caps, and they could make some more money.
Exactly.
Well, again, I mean, first, the opposite is happening in areas where there are caps. You see the caps, lifting as capacity grows.
Right.
But the second point, it goes back to Blair's point. Okay, it's if you have capacity constraints, that's where you end up just by the laws of supply and demand. Okay, that if you've added sufficient capacity and keep the investment going to continue keeping up with this, then you don't run into these problems.
Okay, so we can go to the audience. We have Max, and if you'll raise your hand, and then when you speak, you can make a comment as opposed to a question. It could be either one. Just keep it short. And I just identify yourself, who you are, who you're with. And seeing no questions. Oh, here we go. Start with this one and then over there.
My name is Andrew Gallo. I want to focus on and highlight something Tim brought up in the terminating monopoly. According to the FCC, 30% or about a third of the U.S. citizens have access to exactly one ISP, and nearly 70% only have two choices. That's no competition in the market effectively. This means that the monopolies, the terminating monopoly carriers like Comcast, can start using their customers, or as Netflix mentioned, their eyeballs, as weapons in extracting payment from third parties, such as the content providers. So combine that with what Tim just mentioned about the degradation threats, and what Blair mentioned before about Wall Street not wanting bandwidth, they want dividends, you end up in a situation where congestion becomes a business weapon. And I think we're seeing that now, and I think that's the biggest danger of not having some type of FCC oversight.
So, Jim, you've
Sure.
tried to address that a couple of times, but let's try again.
First of all, we're not against FCC oversight, okay? And I've testified in support of FCC oversight. Honestly, the only debate on that in terms of the last mile is really, what section of the law is appropriate to use to ensure against the hypothetical behavior. And I don't take it lightly, but we're arguing for, obviously the 706 approach. We think that could cover it. If it doesn't, you can always reconsider using other tools there. In terms of the Comcast arrangement, first, we're out there, and I think a lot of what we're doing with the broadband expansion announcements connected with DirecTV is we're shooting to be, a nationwide competitor against cable. It's hard, and DirecTV can't do it on its own because it doesn't have that broadband connection. They can't offer Netflix today, and I appreciated the supportive comments, from Netflix CFO about, the broadband aspects of our deal. Hopefully, we can provide that. But I'd also add this: I don't think anybody can reliably predict where the leverage in a business negotiation goes. I think the FCC can sit and exercise oversight, but I don't know where the business leverage is between a Netflix and a Comcast, for example. If Netflix decided all of a sudden to pay you, heck, you pay us. Your customers, want access to Netflix. We're not going to give it to them unless you pay us X.
And that's exactly what we're trying to avoid.
By the way, that's exactly what happens today with retransmission consent.
And so we don't want to have consumers caught in New York without their CBS.
Anyway,
that doesn't seem like a good model to go forward.
I appreciate your intervention, but the point I'm making, is that it's hard to sit there right now and know where the leverage is in a commercial negotiation. You see if there's breakdowns at the end of the day that harm consumers. And that's the appropriate basis for the FCC to exercise oversight and act if consumers are abused.
Can I add just one quick thing to that? Everyone on this panel said, and I think reasonably, that capacity is something we'd all like to see more of. It's sort of a national. It's the bandwidth. More bandwidth is like American is apple pie or something. But the question is, what are the incentives that get you there? And I think, as this gentleman's pointed out, if there is money to be made from congestion, then there's no incentive to have more capacity. And it's that simple. And so it's very important to try.
Not from that one company, but there is then incentive. If there's congestion, doesn't that give incentive for competitors to come in?
If you have a competitive market.
Well, depending on the barriers to entry, and depends on a lot of different factors. Right. And the point I would make is the investment equation there are multiple factors. And it turns out, you mentioned the FCC oversight. The FCC actually has relatively few levers. They have some very important ones, but they have relatively few levers on driving fiber deeper relative to what a city has. And that's why Google's focus or Gig.U's focus or other people's focus has been with those cities in driving it. But it's never one factor, it's always multiple factors.
Look, I don't dispute that sometimes companies, I guess, can find a way to make money from scarcity. But generally, it's not a good business plan. And by the way, if that is the preferred business model, then then we've made a very bad decision with trying to roll out, gigabit services in 100 cities.
Let's get another question. So, right there.
Yeah, hi, Will Reinhardt from the American Action Forum. So there's a lot of talk in kind of, a couple, I guess almost an hour ago now, about the interconnection regime. And the FCC has, the interconnection regime with the FCC and the traditional POTS regime has not been particularly good. And here we've talked a lot about consumer harm, input foreclosure, the holdup problem. I'm wondering, where's the FTC in this issue? And where you guys think the FTC can fit into this? Because they seem to actually be the jurisdiction or the agency that deals with consumer harm issues as compared to
Consumer harm and antitrust and
course.
competition. Sure, Chris.
One of the consequences of Brand X, which is a decision that I worked on when I was at the agency, was to put the FTC back in the game, right? Because if they're common carrier services at issue, the FTC is essentially sidelined, and the FCC has more institutional expertise. But what I want to say in response to your comment and question is that if there's one thing that the FCC should be expert in, it should be network interconnection. So if we have a concern about their institutional competency around that issue, and if we think that the POTS regime, I'm not sure the POTS regime failed. There were certainly difficulties, see like access charges, examples like that, but they were addressed by the agency. And I'm going to suggest that if we don't think they can do interconnection, I'm not sure there's going to be a lot they can do well.
Okay, next question, I think down over there.
Baron Soka, Tech Freedom.
Can you stand up and
Sure.
tell us again who you are?
Baron Soka, Tech Freedom. Tim was my internet law professor, so I blame him for did or didn't learn about internet law. So Tim, you've compared the broadband industry to OPEC. You've told us all how uncompetitive it is, and yet you think that the FCC can forbear from all the provisions of Title II that you think are inappropriate. So Mike, I have two questions for you. So one, which provisions exactly do you think of Title II should apply that the FCC should not forbear from? And what's the basis for doing so? How do you square the findings that the FCC is required by law to make with your assessment about the state of the market?
Thank you very much. It's a good question. I think the FCC should move towards a model where it understands Title II as a grant of authority to define what exactly it means by unjust discrimination, unreasonable unjust discrimination, which is the relevant language, and focus on that part of the Title II statute and leave almost all of the rest behind. That's my answer. I think it's clearly justified in doing so by the change in conditions, and now I'll borrow from other people, over the last, since 1934. I think there's strong reasons to think that while the FCC was appointed to take care of moving information from one place to another place, the way that is done has changed so much that forbearance is justified.
Can I just?
No, go ahead, Anna Marie.
Okay, so I'm a state commission, and I looked at Google's balance sheet, and I see $59 billion sitting there, and I think that'd be a great place to get some money to support universal service in my state. So I'm going to go and demand that the provisions related to universal service apply to all of these content providers who are arguably common carriers under Title II. One example. I'm a content provider. I don't like the split on advertising. I'm going to go back and demand pricing regulation on Google again in this case. Sorry to be picking on Google, in order to make sure that I get a just and reasonable price for my content, which is going over, for the transmission of my content, which is going over. How are you going to get the courts to not read all of Title II, but only focus on the one section you want them to focus on, and get all this other forbearance? I mean, that's where, as someone who looks at it from the investor perspective, my mind just boggles.
Can I follow up too? And I think the only difference that I probably have with Tim was kind of what's the best section of the law to use for the FCC, because I think we're in rough agreement about what we want the FCC to prevent, the problem with Title II and the term no unjust and unreasonable discrimination is that it's got 80 years of FCC precedent and federal court decisions about what it means. And it's very clear from those decisions that it allows and protects differentiated services. And in fact, it says that you can discriminate. You can charge a Google less than you charge the guy in the garage, as long as you apply the same prices, terms, and conditions to everybody that's similarly situated. So if we're sitting here worrying about paid prioritization of fast lanes, slow lanes, okay, you got 80 years of precedent if you invoke those terms saying what that means, and it actually backfires on you. Versus 706, which is almost a greenfield section in many ways. It was kind of interpreted for the first time here. And they said it was an independent grant of authority, and I think we feel that the FCC has a better chance of doing what it wants to do and what everybody wants it to do by using that section instead, where you don't have all the baggage of what it means, and by the way, where the term unreasonable actually relates to harm to broadband deployment. Okay, and there's
I have a response. At the risk of turning this to an administrative law class, which it almost is about to, I would suggest that agencies have the freedom under administrative law in general to change their minds as to how they do things. And yes, while there's 80 years of precedent, they can announce a new interpretation of the words unjust and unreasonable that have been adapted due to the changing conditions since 1934, namely that they're now regulating information moving over from one place to another, a telecommunications service over the internet, as opposed to over the phone lines, and therefore they have decided on a different set of rules, which are basically net neutrality rules. And as for all these other efforts, to collect from Google Universal Sons, the FCC can say, no, we forbear from those portions, and they have the authority to forbear. That is why the forbearance portion was written, to create the possibility of the FCC being much more deregulatory.
And
I mean, that was the whole point. That is the purpose.
But they can be sued.
You can sue anyone for anything. That doesn't mean you will win.
But Tim, you create an incentive here. Do you create an incentive here, though, for everybody that is caught by those provisions, including universal service, to ensure that everybody else they compete with, including internet companies, are treated similarly? And over time, I think that wears down if it doesn't immediately.
Chris, do you have another quick point?
The court was very clear. It's a very stark choice that the agency has before it. If you like a world where ISPs get to charge Google and Amazon and Netflix and small startups different rates to get their traffic back to the consumer, then you'll choose 706. If you want a ban on paid priorities in the last mile and discrimination at interconnection, you'll choose Title II.
Okay.
Title II guarantees that
Jim,
the
we will never
companies,
take our interpretation.
it guarantees that
Your
we have to
interpretation
get
of Title II is
paid
different
for
than
the
ours.
transmission of traffic. I don't see how that gets you to zero.
Okay, so I think we've now pretty much exhausted. I know that you can go back and forth.
Let me
on
just
this.
say that there is a provision that deals with settlements for interconnect in Title II. It's Bill
Okay.
and Keep Interconnect.
Okay, let's move on because there's a lot of other questions. The man right back there.
Mark Cooper, Consumer Federation. I think Jim and I were the only two people in the room, maybe on the planet, who supported the 2010 order.
At least it showed up to testify.
And so, but I really want to start by challenging something Anna Marie said, and it gets to be really important. She described this wonderful world of peering that the internet grew up under for 30 years. She left out the fact that and she said non-regulatory, she left out the fact that the FCC had taken a very decisive regulatory action before that started. It was called the computer inquiries. And if they had allowed the dominant interconnectors of the time to do whatever they wanted in this space, you would have never gotten that wonderful free market, because the people with the market power would have mucked it up. Second observation is, let's be clear, the 30 years of wonderful internet development under the computer inquiries did not take place under Title II. Data transmission has never been regulated under Title II. It was regulated ancillary to Title, as an ancillary authority on Title I. There's a direct line here, and Jim misspoke as well. wait, somebody misspoke when they said that this is the first time 706 has been applied. In fact, we have 3 clear applications of 706. We had the data roaming order, which is a really important order because it was a non-common carrier service that was regulated, and it was data transmission. We have the universal service order out of the 10th Circuit,
That's right.
which basically says it's non-common carrier, but it's regulated. And we also now have the open internet order, which says the same thing. It seems to me that the ancillary authority under which we gave birth to the internet has now been replaced, whether we like it or not, by 706. And it's a different approach. It's not Title III, it's not Title II. And the real challenge is going to be, Tim says we can go back and change our mind, and that's certainly the case, or we can go forward and see what we can do under 706, which has now been upheld 3 times by the courts. And that's going to start to make the big court fairly comfortable with interpreting that.
Okay.
No, Mark's exactly right. I thank you for the correction.
Mark, I have a question of you with Consumers Union. And that is, recently Amazon has restricted access to Hachette books, as I understand it. Would you, in some way or another, regulate that or find anything wrong with that? Or where do you stand on something like that?
Well, we participated. We filed comments in that proceeding. Tony had comments in the Apple court case, which sort of, you have to remember, Amazon won a big court case, a big antitrust price fixing case. People were stunned. This is the first negotiation after that court case. Did you think Amazon was going to roll over and play dead? No, they're going to bargain very hard. The question here is, and I actually just got an email from my daughter who congratulated me for making this description. Is the Amazon Hachette the sharp elbows of competition that we love, or the brass knuckles of the abuse of power that we hate? This is a very, very tough call. It might be a violation of the Sherman Act.
Okay.
It might not.
Comment on that. I like antitrust as much as I like, and I feel the antitrust. Amazon's starting to annoy me a little bit with this stuff, and if the antitrust authorities aren't having a look at it, I feel they should at least be having a talking to about, because Amazon is in that market. They are a book publisher, and they're using, they are, have considerable power in the delivery of book market. In fact. But anyway, this is a slightly different topic.
It is.
But there is something that is a job for antitrust.
It's been bothering me too,
Yeah.
and I've just wondered if, I have you all here.
Well, because it starts getting close to speech. This is actually not antitrust, but it gets close to speech too, because nobody likes the idea of this sort of the seller of all books suddenly deciding, oh, this book's not getting there.
Right back there, right there.
Well, I was going to ask a question, but now I'm going to
Name
change.
first. Name
Fred
first.
Campbell from CBIT. Do you want me to stand? Or? Like, I just want to say I could be wrong, but I thought Computer 2 was about who should be treated as a common carrier or not. The question of what non-common carriers or information service providers paid or not paid was an ESP exemption issue that was supposed to be temporary under the access charge regime. And if you go to Bill and Keep, I think Bill and Keep applies only to common carriers and how they treat each other. So there's a lot of legal stuff getting mixed up here, and I don't think we've been very clear about it. Computer 2 is not who pays, it's who gets regulated by the FCC. That's I don't think that's what net neutrality is about. But that's my comment, not a question. The question was surpassed when you said stop talking about that other stuff.
Oh, right up here.
Chris, you just gave a very full-throated.
Identify
sorry,
yourself,
Senna Fitzmaurice from Comcast, so I've enjoyed all the
good.
discussion. Chris just gave a very full-throated endorsement in some way of Title II, but Netflix hasn't said directly that it does support Title II. So I was just wondering if you were willing to clarify that. Maybe I missed the first 2 minutes.
No. So what we're saying is that the commission should look at the policy And if they think openness policy is important, they should use all the available tools at its disposal. So that includes merger conditions, it includes voluntary agreements, and it includes the statute, Title I and Title II.
So yes.
Because there are all sorts of, Senator, there are all sorts of permutations of Title II
Right, that's true.
that could come out, and I don't think anybody knows yet. It's the agency's lawyers that'll figure it out. So we don't have a firm view on that specific question.
But just to clarify something, I think it's interesting that Jim said that he and Tim kind of agree on the actual, well, in my metaphor, we agree on what the house should look like. We completely disagree on the foundation on which we should build this house. And that, and part of the interesting part about the debate, as I've watched it over, again, 10 years, is the extent to which you have all of these kind of legal arguments. That's where it got most heated. But we actually kind of agree on what the house looks like. And I would also note in the 3 examples of where the commission has acted, there really wasn't that much disagreement about that, even though, again, I would contend if you look backwards, none of the chair who acted actually had legal authority to do what they did. They said they did, yes.
Just to follow
And
up.
if I had been their chief of staff, I would have said they did too. But my point is that the institution as an institution, and Chris was saying this about interconnection, there are multiple tools at their disposal, and we spend a huge amount of time focused on what I think are, it's not that they're not important issues, but they aren't issues that actually get the country where we need to go.
I think that, fair point. I think Tim and I do agree in terms of the problem, and that we need to guard against this fear. I don't think it's a fear based in reality, but I acknowledge that it's a fear many people feel deeply. You can't look at the comments online and not understand that. And so it's certainly not anything we intend to do or want to do. We don't want to see the internet move in this direction. And so we have a proposal out there under 706, admittedly, but the chairman has said, I can stop this bad behavior under 706, and I will. We think he can, and we believe he will. We support that, and I think the question really is whether we give that a chance. You know, you could always come back and revisit the Title II question if some are right that, gee, that can't work, or gee, it might not survive a court challenge or something like that. You still have whatever is in Title II currently in reserve, but if we can solve the problem without risking all of these other harms, and you would only use it in a very limited way if I understand you anyway, and so why not give the chairman a chance to prove he's right, we think he is, and solve the problem, and then let's move on to the capacity issues.
Speaking of moving on, we've got 3 more questions. I'm going to get all 3 questions and then go to the panel. But before we do that, Jim, would you say that your position in terms of would speak for most carriers? I mean, you've talked with them. Are you sort of an outlier of the carriers and the good guy?
Well, I mean, we have Comcast in the room. We can ask them directly. I'm not going to speak for them, but I think
your own description.
We did well. Look, I mean, one company did challenge the 2010 rule, and we didn't. I testified in support of it. So it's not to say there might not be some differences, but I also think that you know, as Tim said earlier, people have a right to change their minds. And I think other carriers are roughly in accord on this. I can't speak for them. They have to speak for themselves.
Okay. So we're going to get the 3 comments. There's one back there, there's one over here, and one here. I think those are the 3. And we'll take all 3 questions and then finish up. Go ahead. Yes, you are. Say who you are.
Brooks Public, Politico. This chairman may be willing to enforce a 706 rule or revisit Title II, but if it's Chairman Ajit Pai, the Title II docket is closed. What happens then?
Okay, that's one question. We're just going to, we'll come back to all these.
All right.
We got another question out there? Go ahead.
Sure. Hal Singer, PPI. This is a question Jim raised about who controls the bargaining power in this relationship between, say, Netflix and an ISP. One quick comment and then a question. You know, if you're a fan of Orange is the New Black, you really only need one input in that relationship. It's Netflix, right? I'm not loyal to the ISP. I want my Netflix. Second is a question, which is, if and this is in reaction to Google Fiber's release that they would not charge an interconnection fee. It occurred to me, if you were put in a situation where one ISP wanted to charge you a fee, an exorbitant fee, and the other one did not, is there anything that would stop Netflix from setting two different prices for its retail package? One for customers of the high-priced ISP and another for the low-priced ISP?
Okay.
And if there is nothing that stops you, wouldn't that be more powerful than a regulatory weapon?
Okay, and last question over here.
Forgive me, I'm really new to covering this, but from a
Say
legal
who you are
perspective-
and
Oh, I'm sorry, that's right. My name is Brandon Ross. I'm with Bloomberg BNA, reporter, obviously. So with regards to the legal aspect of things, right now, from what I understand, it's leaning towards 706, right? Okay. But is there a strong legal chance that if the FCC decided to reclassify under Title II, that they would have enough legal backing or power to do that? And do you guys think that that's a viable option at this point?
Okay, 3 questions. First one, if there's a different FCC chair, is Title II, in other words, you could forbear basically everything. Second, the one I really got was the 2 prices, and the third is what's the legal authority, or where does the legal authority go in terms of Title II and 706? You're free to answer. You want to answer the 2 price one first?
The pricing question. Yeah, it's actually something I thought of recently, and I think that I give 2 responses to it. One is, it's fair to say that the interconnection fees that are being charged here are, and I think our CFO said this at the same conference that Jim alluded to, is not as big, for example, as our content costs. So the price differentiation you're referring to is likely to be so small, the costs of it would outweigh the benefits, because the differences in price wouldn't be so huge and customer affecting.
Okay. Anybody? Tim, you want to go
Yeah,
to
sure.
the FCC chair?
I'm going to try to say something that covers everything. How's
Yeah,
that?
good, because this is time to wrap
we're
up
kind
as
of,
well.
kind of in the end. I sometimes think it's a pity. It's a kind of part of American legal culture is we end up talking about highly interesting substantive issues by talking about jurisdiction as opposed to the actual issue, and you have these really important issues. I mean, half the civil rights movement was about the Interstate Commerce Clause. It's like we have this weird way. It's like America sometimes like a dysfunctional family where you can't really talk about what you're talking about, and you talk about something else instead. That's like Section 5 of 14th Amendment or something weird like that.
My family talks about that all the time.
Yeah. And I think what is the most important game here, I've always thought, are the norms. And this is something where Jim and I agree. The norms, and it's been the whole story of the internet, is that it has been a story of norms being more important than law. And so one thing I would take from this discussion is that the fact that the norm of net neutrality is strong actually is doing a lot of work in this area. But there are areas where there is normative disagreement and when we're trying to figure out what the future will be. And they are mainly around, that's why people started shouting during interconnection. Because there is this possibility that some of the things that I consider the downsides of violations of net neutrality can happen through an interconnection framework at the termination monopoly point. And so I guess I'll close my comments by saying that I think the Commission should take seriously what is called in the jargon sender-side rules. That it should be thinking about trying to figure out exactly this problem of interconnection and what its rules should be for that. And I think that whatever it does in the last mile, that really should be something that becomes the focus of its attention over the next couple of months.
And so this last question about jurisdiction.
Let me try that.
Well, you can reopen
you can reopen the docket. I mean, I think what should give you confidence is this. First, that you've had actually pretty strong bipartisan agreement on what the principles should be, okay, and what the behavior should be. It was a Republican commission that first enunciated the principles that Charlie laid out, Brooks.
True.
And Kevin Martin, in fact, imposed them in a spectrum auction, for God's sake. So, I mean, I do think in terms of the core elements, you have support there. What you've had at the commission is a disagreement on means, not unlike some of the things we're talking about here. The most important thing, I think, is this: that the major companies in this environment have made their business plans and their investments based on a net neutrality environment, okay? Based on the 2010 rule, based on the original internet principles, okay? We are not developing business models to you know, along the lines of paid prioritization or fast lanes, slow lanes. Our investment proves that, okay? We're investing in capacity, okay? If you're wanting to sell a fast lane and a slow lane, the worst thing you could be doing is investing in capacity. So I think the assurance going forward against bad behavior is, as Tim said, the development of these norms. And I think the FCC, if it sees bad acts, okay, and Republican chairmen as well as Democratic chairmen, when they have seen these things, they have intervened. Okay, they have taken action, and I don't think that would change on a going forward basis. I don't think a Republican commission down the road, if we ever have one, will act inconsistent with that. But more important, I don't think any company is going to act inconsistent with
The Party is that net neutrality is a solution of looking for a problem. Commissioner Pye, Commissioner O'Reilly, Chairman Walden, Chairman Upton all think that the idea is basically crap and we shouldn't have net neutrality. I believe it was a plank in the Republican platform that net neutrality should not exist. So to act like every chairman is going to act like every other chairman ignores the fact that we do have these big things called elections, and they do change the way policy happens.
I think I think all of those things were about FCC regulation. Okay, I don't think they were saying that we're against the concept of net neutrality. Now,
okay, yeah. So we can and.
Can I say a word about the court cases?
And he is a strong Republican background, so you know we're really.
I'm not saying that Commissioner Powell and Commissioner Martin did not plow the ground in this area. But if you look at the Republican Party, and I don't care Republican or Democrat one way or another, but if you look at the statements of the Republican Party currently, network neutrality is an issue the government should not have anything at all to do with. That's not true.
Yeah,
okay,
I think, I mean, that point's absolutely right. If you read the statements that are made, it is about the tools the FCC is using, okay? There's no doubt in my mind that in the future, if a company were to misbehave, a Republican commission, just as in the past, would come down on them the same way a Democratic commission would do.
Okay, last comments. And one thing you could just, essentially one of the things you're pointing out, and something I've thought all along, is that ad hoc adjudication, individual adjudication, may be another way of addressing and enforcing these kinds of regulation as opposed to a rulemaking.
Well, it's always going to be that way, but you know, but you might want to have a rule to give some people an idea that there's something's banned.
Okay. Okay.
All right. Anyway.
Any last comments, Chris?
Only to say that we have done this 2 or 3 times before, and to pick up on Jim's point, which is they have made promises. We should at least take the things that have been said before in the docket as a way of narrowing the dispute, so you can avoid the religious war around Title II by saying that everybody agreed to this in 2010, so we're just arguing about these 1 or 2 new things that are relevant today. I know that jurisdiction is part of that, but it feels like there's an opening there to narrow the issues, and Chairman Wheeler should take that up when he does his remand.
Okay, did you want to follow up to we didn't really answer your question?
Can I modify it a little bit? So you all talked about how we should move forward, and we're kind of wasting time arguing about who has jurisdiction, or rather, which jurisdiction FCC has in regulating net neutrality and all that. So between 706 and Title II, which one do you guys feel is less likely to get as much pushback from a legal perspective, so that we don't spend the next 5 or 10 years in a legal battle?
I would argue 706. I mean, Title II. If Title II is invoked for any purpose, I guarantee you that it'll be a very long list of people filing litigation pretty immediately after that. I think a consensus is formed around 706.
Okay, so I think we've come to the end of the hour. People, it's great that you have lasted 2 straight hours in this room, this hot room, long debate. I think it's very encouraging to have a sound, rational discussion of net neutrality. I learned a lot. I hope you have. And look forward to your comments at AI Net Neutrality on Twitter. Thank you.